You know, after 32 years wearing the badge, I thought I'd seen it all. Domestic disputes that turn your stomach, crime scenes that make you question humanity, addicts so far gone they're barely human anymore. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on October the 15th, 2018, during what should have been a routine night patrol in the Millbrook district. I'm telling you this now because I'm retiring next month and I can't take this to my grave. The department buried the incident report so deep it might as well be in China. They transferred me to desk duty for 6 months, mandatory psych evaluations, the whole 9 yards. But I know what I saw. I know what we all saw. It started around 11:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was checking my watch, counting down the hours until shift change. My partner that night was Officer Sarah Chen, sharp kid, about 3 years on the force, the kind of cop who actually reads the manual. We were cruising down Maple Street when dispatch crackled through. Unit 47, we have a wellness check at 1247 Elmwood Avenue. Elderly resident, neighbors, report no activity for several days. Possible 10 to 54 inches. A possible dead body. Great, just what you want 2 hours before you clock out. Copy that, dispatch. Unit 47 responding. Sarah flipped on the lights, no sirens for a welfare check, and we headed toward the old residential district. Elmwood Avenue was one of those streets where the houses were built in the 1920s. Big Victorian things with wraparound porches and too many shadows. Most of them had been converted to apartments years ago, but 1247 was still a single-family home. The place looked like something out of a horror movie. I'm not being dramatic. I mean, it literally looked like central casting had picked it for a ghost story. Peeling paint, overgrown yard, broken shutters hanging at odd angles. The kind of house kids dare each other to touch on Halloween. Cheerful place, Sarah muttered, grabbing her flashlight from the console. We approached the front door, and I knocked. 3 solid raps that echoed through the house. Police department, wellness check. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time. Mrs. Henderson, we're here to check on you. That's when I heard it. A sound from inside, not quite knocking, not quite scratching, like someone dragging fingernails across wood. Sarah heard it too. I could tell by the way her hand drifted toward her service weapon. Mrs. Henderson, I called again. The scratching stopped. We walked around to the back of the house, checking windows, looking for any sign of forced entry or, anything that might explain the smell. Because there was definitely a smell. Sweet and sour at the same time, like fruit left out too long in the sun. I'd smelled it before, at crime scenes where the body had been there for days. But this was different, stronger, like it was coming from inside the house but also from the ground beneath our feet. The back door was unlocked. Now, I've been doing this long enough to know that unlocked doors in situations like this usually mean one of 2 things. Either the person is inside and unable to respond, or someone else has been inside recently. Neither option fills you with confidence. Should we wait for backup? Sarah asked, and I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. She was good police, but she was still young enough to follow protocol instead of gut instinct. I should have said yes. God help me, I should have said yes. We're just checking on an elderly woman, I said instead. In and out, 5 minutes. Famous last words. The door opened into a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a museum. Floral wallpaper, linoleum floors, appliances from the Carter administration. But everything was wrong. The refrigerator was humming too loudly, a deep mechanical drone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The fluorescent light above the sink was flickering in a pattern that almost seemed deliberate. 3 quick flashes, pause, 3 quick flashes, pause. And that smell was stronger now, mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the morgue, but also of electrical fires and ozone after a lightning strike. "Mrs. Henderson," I called out, my voice echoing through the house in a way that didn't make sense. The kitchen wasn't that big, but my voice seemed to bounce off walls that were farther away than they should be. That's when we heard the radio. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the house, playing what sounded like a talk show. But the voices were wrong, too slow, like a recording played at the wrong speed. And underneath it, barely audible, was something that sounded like crying, or maybe laughing. It was hard to tell. Sarah and I exchanged glances. She had her weapon drawn now, and I followed suit. We moved through the kitchen into a hallway lined with family photos. Normal stuff. Weddings, graduations, Christmas mornings. But in the flickering light from the kitchen, the faces seemed to be watching us. Not metaphorically, literally. Their eyes followed our movement, tracking left to right as we passed. The radio was coming from the living room. We could see the glow of it around the corner, painting the walls in shifting patterns of amber and red. As we got closer, I could make out what the voices were saying. "And the children just disappeared," one voice was saying. "Right from their beds, no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, just gone." "How terrible," another voice responded. "Did they ever find them?" "Oh, yes. Yes, they found them. Pieces of them anyway, scattered through the woods like presents." I felt Sarah tense beside me. This wasn't a normal radio program. The voices were too clear, too close, like they were coming from inside the room with us. And there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. The voices sounded familiar. Not like people I knew, but like voices I'd heard before, in courtrooms and interrogation rooms and crime scenes. We rounded the corner into the living room, and that's when I saw her. Mrs. Henderson was sitting in her recliner, facing the radio. She was wearing a faded blue housecoat, her gray hair neatly arranged, hands folded in her lap. She looked perfectly normal, except for the fact that she'd been dead for at least a week. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered. The radio was an old thing, probably from the 1950s, with a large round dial and fabric speakers. But it wasn't plugged in. The cord was coiled neatly beside it on the end table, and it was still playing. "They say you can still hear them sometimes," the radio voice continued. "Late at night when the wind is just right, calling for their mothers." I reached for my radio to call it in, but all I got was static. Sarah tried hers, same thing. Dead air. Not even the usual background chatter from dispatch. Just white noise that seemed to echo the sound of Mrs. Henderson's breathing, if dead people could breathe. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, and I agreed. This was beyond a wellness check. This was a crime scene, a coroner's case, something for people with more training and better equipment than 2 patrol officers with flashlights. But as we turned to leave, the radio stopped. The silence was absolute. No humming refrigerator, no flickering lights, no wind outside. Just dead. Heavy silence that seemed to press against your eardrums like deep water. Then Mrs. Henderson turned her head and looked at us. "I've seen a lot of dead bodies in my career. I know what death looks like. The way the skin changes color, the way the eyes cloud over, the way rigor mortis sets in. And Mrs. Henderson was dead, had been dead for days. But she was looking at us with eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like a cat's, and her mouth was moving, shaping words we couldn't hear. Sarah made a sound. Not quite a scream, not quite a sob. Something primal and terrified that I'd never heard from her before. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the hallway, but the house had changed. The corridor we'd walked through 5 minutes earlier now stretched out in front of us like a tunnel. The family photos multiplying along the walls, the faces in them shifting and changing as our flashlight beams passed over them. "This isn't real," Sarah was saying, over and over. "This isn't real." But it felt real. The floorboards creaking under our feet felt real. The smell of decay and something else, something like ozone after a lightning strike, felt real. And the sound of Mrs. Henderson's chair creaking as she stood up behind us felt very, very real. We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 2 trained police officers ran like teenagers from a haunted house. We stumbled through that impossible hallway, past dozens of photos of people we'd never seen, their eyes following us, their mouths opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and with each step, I could hear Mrs. Henderson behind us, her slippers shuffling against the hardwood floor, getting closer. The kitchen door seemed miles away, but we finally reached it, burst through it, and found ourselves in the backyard. The October air hit us like a slap, cold and clean and beautifully normal. Our radios crackled back to life, dispatch asking for our status. "Unit 47, we have a 1054 at 1247 Elmwood," I managed to say. "Requesting backup and the coroner." "Copy that, Unit 47. ETA on backup is 7 minutes. 7 minutes. We waited in the patrol car, neither of us speaking, both of us staring at the house. The windows were dark now, and there was no sound from inside. No radio, no movement, nothing. But I swear I could see a figure in the front window standing perfectly still, watching us. The backup units arrived. 2 patrol cars and a supervisor. The coroner showed up 20 minutes later. They found Mrs. Henderson exactly where we'd left her, sitting in her chair, dead for an estimated week to 10 days. Natural causes, they said. Heart failure. The radio was on the end table, unplugged, covered in dust. They found no evidence of the radio program we'd heard, no explanation for our radio blackout, no reason why the house had seemed different. The official report listed it as a routine wellness check with a deceased subject found in residence. But I know what happened in that house. Sarah knows too, though she transferred to the day shift and won't talk about it. She won't even make eye contact when we pass in the hallway. The thing that haunts me, and I mean that literally, is what Mrs. Henderson was trying to tell us. I've thought about it every night since then, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mouth was moving, shaping words, and I think she was trying to warn us. About what? I don't know. But 3 weeks later, a family of 4 disappeared from their home, 2 streets over from Elmwood Avenue. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. Just gone. They found pieces of them scattered through Miller's Woods. I requested a transfer to the day shift after that. They approved it without question. I think they were relieved to have me away from night patrol, away from the Millbrook district, away from houses where the dead sit in their chairs and radios play programs from nowhere. But sometimes late at night I still hear that radio, not in the station, not in my house, but in my head. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can almost make out what Mrs. Henderson was trying to tell us. I think she was trying to say, don't let them find you. The psychological evaluation came 3 days after the incident. Dr. Patricia Morrison, department shrink, sat across from me in her sterile office with its beige walls and motivational posters about resilience. She had my files spread out in front of her like evidence at a crime scene. "Tell me about the house, Detective Walsh," she said, pen poised over her notepad. "In your own words." In my own words. Like there were other words I could use. like someone else could describe what we saw in that living room, what we heard coming from that unplugged radio, what we felt when Mrs. Henderson turned her dead eyes toward us. It was a routine wellness check, I started, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. Nothing about that night had been routine. Dr. Morrison nodded, made a note. And you mentioned in your preliminary report that you experienced some unusual sensations while inside the residence. Unusual sensations. That's what they were calling it. Not the truth. Not the fact that a dead woman had stood up from her chair and followed us down a hallway that changed shape like a living thing. Unusual sensations. The house felt wrong, I said finally. From the moment we walked in, the temperature, the sounds, the way our voices echoed, it didn't feel like a normal house. And Officer Chen experienced these same feelings. You'd have to ask her, but I knew she wouldn't. Sarah had already been through her evaluation, had already been cleared for duty with a recommendation for stress management counseling. She'd learned to give the right answers, to describe everything in terms of environmental factors and psychological stress. Smart girl. Dr. Morrison leaned forward. Detective Walsh, you've been with the department for 31 years. You've seen trauma, violence, situations that would break most people. But this one house, this one call, has affected you differently. Can you help me understand why? Because Mrs. Henderson was still talking. That's what I wanted to tell her. Because every night since October 15th, I'd been hearing that scratching sound, those fingernails dragging across wood. Because I'd started avoiding the Millbrook district entirely, taking longer routes to calls, finding excuses to patrol other areas. Because Sarah had started calling in sick more often, and when she was at work, she jumped at every shadow, every unexpected noise. But I couldn't say any of that. Not if I wanted to keep my badge, my pension, my reputation intact. I don't know, I said instead. Maybe you're right. Maybe it was just stress. She made another note, and I wondered what she was writing. Probably something about defensive responses and denial. She closed the file and gave me that practice smile that therapists perfect in graduate school. I'm going to recommend you for return to full duty, she said, with the understanding that you'll attend weekly stress management sessions for the next month. I nodded, shook her hand, and walked out of her office feeling like I'd just lied under oath, which, in a way, I had. The stress management sessions were a joke, breathing exercises and meditation techniques taught by a perky counselor who looked like she'd never seen anything worse than a parking ticket. But I attended every one, played the part of the grateful officer, learning to cope with the pressures of the job. And all the while, the scratching got louder. It started small. I'd be filling out paperwork at my desk and hear something that sounded like mice in the walls. I'd be at home watching television and catch a sound from the kitchen that made me check the windows, make sure they were locked. My wife noticed first. "You're not sleeping," Linda said one morning over coffee. "You wake up every hour, listening for something." She was right. I'd been sleeping in 2-hour stretches, waking up to silence that felt too thick, too heavy. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath and strain your ears for sounds that shouldn't be there. "Work stuff," I told her. "It'll pass." But it didn't pass. If anything, it got worse. The scratching became more frequent, more insistent. And sometimes, late at night when Linda was asleep beside me, I could swear I heard that radio playing. Faint and distant, but unmistakably the same voices, the same slow cadence, the same terrible stories about children disappearing and being found in pieces. I started researching the house on Elmwood Avenue. Not officially. The case was closed. Mrs. Henderson was buried. and the property had been sold to a developer who planned to tear it down and build condos. But I had access to records, and I had questions that wouldn't let me sleep. The house had been built in 1923 by a doctor named Edmund Blackwood. He'd lived there with his wife Margaret and their 2 children until 1941, when the family had simply vanished. No bodies were ever found, no evidence of foul play, no explanation for their disappearance. The house had sat empty for 3 years before being sold to the Henderson family. Mrs. Henderson, Dorothy was her first name, had lived there for 74 years. She'd raised 4 children in that house, buried her husband from that house, watched her own children grow old and move away from that house. She died alone in her recliner, watching that old radio, and according to the coroner's report, she'd been dead for 9 days before we found her. 9 days of sitting in that chair, alone in that house. 9 days of silence. Or maybe not silence. I kept digging, calling in favors from friends at the county clerk's office, at the library, at the historical society. What I found made my hands shake as I read it. The Blackwood family hadn't been the first to disappear from that house. In 1928, 5 years after it was built, the original owner, a businessman named Charles Ashford, had reported strange sounds coming from the walls. Scratching, he'd told police, like someone trapped inside, trying to get out. He'd hired contractors to open up the walls, but they'd found nothing. The sounds had continued until Ashford moved out 3 months later. The house had been sold to a young couple named the Gregories in 1929. They'd lasted 6 months before reporting the same sounds to police. Then they'd been found dead in their bedroom, apparently from carbon monoxide poisoning, though no source for the gas was ever identified. After the Gregories, the house had sat empty until Dr. Blackwood bought it in 1931. He'd lived there for 10 years before he and his family vanished. Then the Hendersons had moved in, and they'd stayed for 3/4 of a century. But what if they hadn't been alone all that time? What if something else had been living in that house, in those walls, feeding on whatever it was that made families disappear and children turn up scattered through the woods like presents? I was thinking about this 2 weeks after my psychological evaluation when dispatch sent me to Miller's Woods. Someone had reported finding what looked like clothing near the old hiking trail. Children's clothing. It was Sarah's case. She was back on night shift, having apparently convinced the department that she was fine. But she'd called in sick again, and they needed someone to secure the scene until the detectives arrived. Miller's Woods covered about 50 acres on the outskirts of town, thick with old-growth trees and hiking trails that most people avoided after dark. It was the kind of place where teenagers went to drink beer and scare each other with ghost stories. It was also where they'd found pieces of the Morrison family 3 weeks after they'd disappeared from their home on Oak Street. The clothing was about 1/4 mile into the woods, hanging from the branches of an old oak tree like Christmas ornaments. A small red jacket, torn and dirty. A pair of child's sneakers, the laces cut. A backpack with cartoon characters on it. Empty, except for a school lunch that had been rotting for weeks. I radioed it in and waited for the detectives, standing guard over evidence that made my skin crawl. The woods were too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you check over your shoulder every few seconds. And as I stood there in the growing darkness, listening to the wind move through the trees, I started to hear something else. Scratching. Faint at first, like an animal moving through the underbrush. But it was coming from above, from the branches of the tree where the clothes were hanging. The sound of fingernails dragging across bark, desperate and persistent. I looked up into the canopy, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and for just a moment, just a split second, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A child's face, pale and wide-eyed, staring down at me from the branches. But it was wrong, twisted, like someone had tried to reassemble a photograph from memory. The eyes were too big, the mouth too wide, and when it opened to speak, no sound came out except that terrible scratching. I blinked, and it was gone. Just leaves and shadows, and the wind making everything move in ways that played tricks on your eyes. But I knew what I'd seen. Just like I knew what I'd heard in that house on Elmwood Avenue. The detectives arrived 20 minutes later, found me standing at the base of the tree, staring up into the branches. "You okay, Walsh?" Detective Morrison asked. No relation to the psychologist, just an unfortunate coincidence that made me think about unusual sensations and stress management every time I heard his name. "Fine," I said, just securing the scene. But I wasn't fine. I was starting to understand that whatever was happening to me, whatever had started in Mrs. Henderson's living room, wasn't going to end with therapy sessions and breathing exercises. It was going to follow me, the way it had followed the families who'd lived in that house, the way it was following Sarah even though she wouldn't admit it. Something was hunting in Millbrook, and it had been hunting for a very long time. The question wasn't whether I was losing my mind. The question was whether I was going to be next. The Morrison family had lived at 1843 Oak Street for 6 years before they disappeared. Tom Morrison worked at the bank. His wife Jennifer taught the 3rd grade at the elementary school, and their twins, 8-year-old Michael and Emma, were the kind of kids who waved at police cars and drew pictures of firefighters. Normal family, normal life, normal house in a normal neighborhood. Until they weren't. I drove past their house the day after we found the clothes in Miller's Woods. Couldn't help myself. The place looked abandoned already, even though it had only been empty for 3 weeks. Yellow crime scene tape still fluttered from the front porch, and newspapers had piled up on the walkway despite the fact that someone should have stopped delivery by now. The windows were dark, but as I sat in my patrol car across the street, I could swear I saw movement inside. Just a shadow passing by the living room window, quick and furtive, like someone trying not to be seen. I radioed dispatch. Unit 47, requesting a supervisor at 1843 Oak Street. Possible break-in. Copy that. Unit 47, supervisor en route. Sergeant Martinez arrived 15 minutes later, and we approached the house together. The front door was locked, sealed with police tape that hadn't been disturbed. We checked the windows, the back door, the basement access. Everything was secure. "What did you see?" Martinez asked as we stood in the backyard. Movement in the front window, someone inside. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing my words against my recent history. The wellness check gone wrong, the psychological evaluation, the stress management sessions that everyone knew about even though they weren't supposed to. "Could have been a trick of the light," he said finally. "Old houses settle, shadows move, your mind fills in the gaps." My mind fills in the gaps. Another way of saying I was seeing things that weren't there. But I knew what I'd seen, just like I knew what I'd heard in Mrs. Henderson's house, just like I knew what I'd glimpsed in the trees in Miller's Woods. "Maybe," I said, "but I'd feel better if we checked inside." Martinez nodded, pulled out his phone, and called Detective Morrison. 20 minutes later, we had a key and permission to enter the house for a security check. The Morrison house was a mirror image of the life that had been interrupted. Dishes in the sink, homework on the kitchen table, a load of laundry still sitting in the washer 3 weeks later, starting to smell of mildew and neglect. Family photos lined the hallway, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer vacations. All the normal markers of a family that should have had decades left together. Kids' rooms are upstairs. Martinez said, checking his notes. Master bedroom, too. Nothing was disturbed, according to the initial report. We climbed the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty house. The children's rooms were exactly as they'd been left. Beds unmade, toys scattered on the floor, books open to pages that would never be finished. Michael's room had model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, turning slowly in the air currents from the heating system. Emma's room was painted pink and purple, with a dollhouse in the corner that was an exact replica of the house we were standing in. That's when I heard it again. The scratching. It was coming from inside the walls, the same sound I'd been hearing for weeks, the same sound that had started in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen, but louder now, more insistent, like something was trying to claw its way out. "You hear that?" I asked Martinez. He stopped, tilted his head, listened. "Hear what?" The scratching continued, moving along the wall behind Emma's bed, following the path of what I assumed were water pipes or electrical conduits. But it sounded too deliberate, too purposeful to be anything structural. Scratching, in the walls. Martinez pulled out his flashlight and examined the baseboards, looking for signs of rodent activity. Could be mice. House has been empty for weeks. Mice. Right. Mice that could scratch in perfect rhythm, that could move through walls without leaving any physical evidence, that could follow you from house to house and make the same sounds at the same times every night. The scratching stopped. Martinez straightened up, looked at me with that expression I was getting used to seeing. Concern mixed with doubt. The look cops give each other when someone's stress is showing. "I think we're good here," he said. "House is secure. Whatever you saw from the street, it's not here now." But it was here. I could feel it. The same presence I'd felt in Mrs. Henderson's house. The same wrongness that had made our radios fail and our voices echo in impossible ways. It was here, and it was watching us, and it was waiting for something. We left the Morrison house and sealed it back up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd missed something important. Something that would have explained why a family of 4 could vanish from their beds without a trace. Why children's clothes ended up hanging in trees like offerings. Why the scratching in the walls followed a pattern that almost sounded like Morse code. That night, I couldn't sleep. Linda had given up asking what was wrong, had started sleeping in the guest room to avoid being woken up by my restlessness. I sat in my recliner in the dark, listening to the house settle around me, waiting for the scratching to start. It began at 2:17 a.m. The same time I realized that Mrs. Henderson had been found dead. The same time that security cameras had captured impossible movements in the mirrors of interrogation rooms in other cities, other states, other cases that had been buried and forgotten and explained away. The scratching came from inside the walls of my own house now, moving through the space behind the living room, following the path of electrical wires and water pipes, but also following something else, something that connected my house to the Morrison house, to Mrs. Henderson's house, to every other place where families had disappeared and children had been found in pieces. I got up, followed the sound through my house, pressing my ear to walls, trying to trace the source. It led me to the basement, to a section of wall behind the water heater where the scratching was loudest. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox and started knocking holes in the drywall, following the sound, trying to find whatever was making it. Behind the drywall was insulation. Behind the insulation was a gap between the studs. And in that gap, I found something that made my hand shake as I pulled it out. A child's drawing, done in crayon and construction paper. It showed a house, my house, with stick figures inside. A man and a woman in one room, sleeping, and in another room, a smaller figure with wide, staring eyes and a mouth opened in a silent scream. At the bottom of the page, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "He lives in the walls now." The drawing wasn't signed, but I recognized the style from the evidence photos I'd seen from the Morrison house. Emma Morrison had been an artist, always drawing pictures of her family, her house, her life. Pictures that her teacher had described as unnaturally detailed for an 8-year-old, with a sophistication that had made the other teachers uncomfortable. I stared at the drawing for a long time, trying to understand how it had gotten into the walls of my house, how a dead child had known what my bedroom looked like, how she had known that something else was living in the spaces between the rooms. The scratching had stopped, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness beyond my flashlight beam, waiting to see what I would do with this new piece of evidence, this proof that whatever was hunting in Millbrook had been planning for much longer than anyone realized. I folded the drawing carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I went upstairs, got my service weapon, and sat back down in my recliner to wait for dawn. Because I was beginning to understand that Mrs. Henderson hadn't been trying to warn us about something that might happen. She'd been trying to warn us about something that was already happening, something that had been happening for decades, moving from house to house, family to family, feeding on whatever it was that made children disappear and parents go mad with grief. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to show itself, and the right people to show it to. Something that had chosen us. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in 7 years. Linda was already at work, the house was empty, and I needed time to think without dispatch calling me to another wellness check or another missing family, or another set of children's clothes hanging from trees like Christmas ornaments from hell. I spread everything out on the kitchen table. Emma Morrison's drawing, copies of the incident reports from the Elmwood Avenue house, photos from the crime scenes in Miller's Woods, a timeline I'd been building in my head for weeks, connecting dates and addresses, and disappearances that went back to 1923. The pattern was there if you knew how to look for it. Every 7 to 10 years, another family would vanish from the Millbrook district, not all at once. That would have attracted too much attention. But one by one, households would report strange sounds. Children would wake up screaming about something in their walls, and then they'd be gone. The Ashfords in 1928, the Gregorys in 1929, the Blackwoods in 1941, the Prescotts in 1952, the Kowalskis in 1963. The list went on. Family after family, decade after decade, each disappearance explained away, or forgotten, or filed under unsolved cases that gathered dust in basements. But Mrs. Henderson had lived in that house for 74 years. She'd seen all of it, heard all of it, known all of it. And somehow, she'd survived when everyone else had vanished. Why? I stared at her photo from the case file. A driver's license picture from 2015, 3 years before we found her dead in her chair. Ordinary woman, gray hair, kind eyes, the sort of person who baked cookies for neighborhood children and fed stray cats. Nothing special about her except for one thing. She'd lived alone. The thought hit me like a physical blow. All the other families, all the other disappearances, they'd involved children. Parents and children together, or just children on their own. But Mrs. Henderson had been alone in that house for the last 15 years, ever since her husband died. Her children were grown and gone, living their own lives in other cities, other states. She'd been alone, and she'd lived. Which meant whatever was hunting in Millbrook needed children, fed on children, took children and left behind pieces in the woods and drawings in the walls that shouldn't exist. My phone rang, making me jump. Dispatch. Walsh, I know you called in sick, but we need you. Missing persons case high priority. I'm off duty, I said, but I was already reaching for my badge and weapon. family of 3, 1456 Cedar Lane. Neighbors reported they haven't seen them in 2 days. Front doors standing open. Cedar Lane was 6 blocks from Elmwood Avenue. 6 blocks from Mrs. Henderson's house, where we'd found her dead in her chair, listening to voices on an unplugged radio. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I folded Emma Morrison's drawing and put it back in my jacket pocket, grabbed my keys, and drove toward what I knew would be another empty house, another crime scene, another family that had simply vanished in the night. The house at 1456 Cedar Lane was a small ranch-style home, with a well-maintained yard and a minivan in the driveway. The front door was indeed standing open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Patrol cars were already on scene, and I could see uniformed officers talking to neighbors on the sidewalk. Officer Martinez, no relation to the sergeant, met me at the crime scene tape. "Kowalski family," he said, checking his notes. "Robert, age 34, works at the lumber yard. Susan, age 31, substitute teacher. Daughter Casey, age 6. Neighbors say they saw the family yesterday evening. Everyone seemed normal. Any sign of forced entry? Negative. Door was open when the neighbor found it this morning, but no signs of struggle inside. House is clean, no evidence of violence." I ducked under the tape and walked toward the open door, but stopped when I heard it. Faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. Scratching. It was coming from inside the house, the same rhythmic sound I'd been hearing for weeks. But this time, it was accompanied by something else. Something that made my blood run cold, a child's voice, singing. The same nursery rhyme over and over, so quiet I had to strain to hear it. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Martinez was still talking, describing the scene, the timeline, the preliminary search. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was walking toward that open door, toward the sound of a dead child singing in an empty house. The living room was normal. Furniture in place, television on but muted. Coffee table covered with coloring books and crayons. A half-finished puzzle spread out on the floor, showing a picture of a family picnic in the woods. The singing was coming from down the hallway. I followed it past family photos, past a bathroom with towels still damp from morning showers, past a master bedroom where the bed was unmade and clothes were laid out for a day that would never come. The child's room was at the end of the hall. Pink walls, white furniture, stuffed animals arranged carefully on the bed. And sitting in the corner, facing away from the door, was a little girl with dark hair. "Casey?" I called softly. She didn't turn around, just kept singing, her voice getting slower and more distorted with each repetition. "Ring around the rosy." I stepped into the room, hand on my weapon, but not drawing it. What was I going to do? Shoot a 6-year-old girl? "Casey, sweetheart, I'm a police officer. Are you okay?" She stopped singing. The silence that followed was worse than the nursery rhyme, thick and heavy and wrong. I could hear the other officers outside calling my name, asking for my location, but their voices seemed to be coming from very far away. "Casey?" She turned around. It wasn't Casey Kowalski. It wasn't any child who had ever been alive. The face that looked at me was pale and distorted, features blurred like a photograph left in water. But the eyes were bright and aware, and when she smiled, I could see too many teeth. "We all fall down," she whispered. The room tilted. The walls seemed to bend inward, and suddenly I was back in Mrs. Henderson's house, in that impossible hallway lined with shifting photographs. But this time, every photo showed the same thing. Children's faces, dozens of them, all pale and wrong, and smiling with too many teeth. "We've been waiting for you," the thing that wasn't Casey said. Mrs. Henderson told us you would come. Mrs. Henderson is dead. Mrs. Henderson is here. They're all here, in the walls, in the spaces between, in the places where the houses remember. I tried to back toward the door, but the hallway behind me had changed. It stretched on forever now, lined with doors that led to rooms I'd never seen, houses I'd never entered, families I'd never met but somehow knew were gone. You can't stop it, she continued. It's been happening too long, feeding too well. The children call to their families, and their families follow them into the walls, into the spaces where time moves differently. What are you? Her smile widened, and I realized that what I'd thought were teeth were actually fingernails, dozens of them, pointing inward like the inside of a trap. Where what's left? What remains when everything else is taken? We live in the walls now, in the spaces between the real and the remembered, and we're so very hungry. The scratching started again, all around me now, coming from every surface, every wall, every door. The sound of fingernails dragging across wood, desperate and persistent and endless. "Ring around the rosy," she sang again, but now her voice was joined by others. Dozens of children's voices, all singing the same nursery rhyme, all getting slower and more distorted until the words became meaningless noise. I ran, through that impossible hallway, past those terrible doors, toward a kitchen that might have been Mrs. Henderson's or the Morrisons' or my own. The voices followed me, getting louder, more insistent, until they weren't singing anymore but screaming. And underneath it all, I could hear Mrs. Henderson's voice, clear as day, saying the words she'd been trying to tell us that night in her living room. "Don't let them find you." But it was too late for that. They'd already found me. They'd been finding me since the moment I'd walked into 1247 Elmwood Avenue, since the moment I'd heard that unplugged radio playing programs that couldn't exist. I burst through a door that should have led outside, but instead led to another hallway, another house, another family that had vanished in the night. And I realized with growing horror that I wasn't running away from anything. I was running deeper into it. I found myself standing in a kitchen I'd never seen before, but somehow knew intimately. 1950s appliances, yellow linoleum floors, a calendar on the wall showing October 1941. The Blackwood house, 77 years ago, on the night they disappeared. But I wasn't alone. Dr. Edmund Blackwood stood at the sink, washing dishes with mechanical precision. His wife Margaret sat at the kitchen table, reading a newspaper that showed headlines about the war in Europe. 2 children, a boy about 10, a girl maybe 8, colored quietly at the breakfast nook. None of them acknowledged my presence. They moved like actors in a play, going through the motions of domestic life while something watched from the spaces between the walls. "You shouldn't be here," a voice said behind me. I turned to find Mrs. Henderson standing in the doorway, but not the Mrs. Henderson we'd found dead in her chair. This was a younger version, maybe 40 years old, wearing a floral dress and an expression of infinite sadness. "You're not supposed to see this part," she continued. "This is their time, their last moments, before the calling started." "What calling?" She gestured toward the children at the breakfast nook. As I watched, the little girl, Mary Blackwood, according to the missing persons report I'd memorized, stopped coloring and tilted her head, as if listening to something only she could hear. "They always hear it first," Mrs. Henderson said. "Children are more sensitive, more open. The boundary between what is and what was is thinner for them." Mary Blackwood put down her crayon and walked to the wall, pressing her ear against it. Her brother followed, then her parents, drawn by whatever she was hearing. Dr. Blackwood's hands dripped dishwater onto the floor as he abandoned the sink and placed his palm flat against the wallpaper. "Do you hear that?" Mary whispered. "The children in the walls. They're calling us to play." The scratching started then, the same sound I'd been hearing for weeks. But now I could hear what was underneath it. Voices, dozens of them, all children, all calling the same words over and over. "Come play with us. Come live in the walls with us. Time doesn't hurt here. Families stay together here. Forever and ever and ever." Dr. Blackwood began tearing at the wallpaper with his fingernails, trying to reach whatever was behind it. Margaret joined him, then the children, all of them clawing frantically at the walls while the voices grew louder and more insistent. "This is how it happens," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice barely audible over the growing chaos. "They hear the calling, and they follow it, into the spaces between houses, between moments, between what was and what could have been." "But you didn't follow," I said. "You lived in that house for 74 years. She turned to look at me, and I saw tears in her eyes. "I had to. Someone had to stay, to watch, to warn. Someone had to remain in the real world to remember what happened to all the others." The Blackwood family had found an opening in the wall, a gap that hadn't been there moments before. One by one, they crawled through it, following the voices of children who had been calling from beyond for decades. Dr. Blackwood went first, then Margaret, then their son Tommy. Mary Blackwood paused at the opening, turned back to look at us with eyes that were already changing, already becoming like the thing I'd seen in Casey Kowalski's room. "Will you come play too?" she asked. "It's nice here. No one gets old, no one gets sick, no one ever has to say goodbye." Then she was gone, and the opening in the wall sealed itself, leaving only pristine wallpaper and the echo of children's laughter. 77 years, Mrs. Henderson said. 77 years they've been in there, playing their games, calling to other families, and I've been listening to them every night, keeping count, remembering their names. The kitchen around us began to fade, the 1940s dissolving into something more recent. Suddenly, we were in the Morrison house, watching Tom and Jennifer Morrison wake up in their bed to the sound of their children singing nursery rhymes in the walls. "The Morrison twins heard them 3 weeks ago," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Emma drew pictures of what she saw, tried to warn her parents. But adults don't listen to children about monsters. They explain them away, medicate them, tell them it's just imagination." I watched as Michael and Emma Morrison crept out of their beds, drawn by voices only they could hear. Their parents followed, still half asleep, trusting their children to lead them somewhere safe. "Where do they go?" I asked. "Between," Mrs. Henderson said simply. "Between the walls, between the moments, between the breathing and the not breathing. They exist in the spaces that houses forget about, the gaps in blueprints, the rooms that were planned but never built." The Morrison family found their opening behind the water heater in the basement, the same place I'd found Emma's drawing. They disappeared into it one by one, and I understood finally how that drawing had ended up in my walls. Emma had known where I lived, had seen my house in whatever twisted geography connected all the disappearances. "Why are you showing me this?" Mrs. Henderson turned to face me fully, and I saw that she was beginning to fade around the edges, becoming translucent like morning mist. "Because it's time for someone else to watch." I held them back as long as I could, kept them contained to one house, one address. But I'm gone now, and they're spreading, moving through the neighborhood like infection, calling to families from every wall, every shadow, every space where children used to play. "I can't. You have to." Her voice was getting fainter, more distant. "You've seen them now, heard them, felt them. You're connected to them the way I was." The way Sarah is, though she's trying to pretend otherwise. The house around us was changing again, becoming my house, my kitchen, my walls. I could see Emma Morrison's drawing where I'd hidden it in my jacket pocket, glowing like a beacon in the growing darkness. What happened to Mrs. Henderson, the real one? She smiled sadly. She listened to them for 74 years, and finally, she couldn't listen anymore. The loneliness broke her heart, literally. Cardiac arrest from the weight of keeping so many secrets, so many names, so many families who trusted their children to lead them to safety. And now? Now she's with them. In the walls, in the spaces between. Playing games that never end with children who never grow up. But someone has to stay behind, has to watch, has to remember. I felt the weight of it settling on me like a lead blanket. The knowledge that every family that disappeared from now on would be my responsibility, my failure, my burden to carry. That I would spend whatever time I had left listening to children's voices in the walls, counting disappearances, trying to warn people who would never believe me. What about Sarah? Mrs. Henderson's image was almost gone now, just a whisper of movement in the shadows. Sarah is fighting it. She thinks if she ignores it, it will go away. But you can't unsee what you've seen, unhear what you've heard. The calling finds everyone who enters their space, eventually. How long do I have? As long as you can resist. As long as you can remember that the real world still exists, still matters. As long as you can carry the weight of their names without letting it crush you. She was gone then, leaving me alone in my kitchen with the sound of scratching in the walls and the weight of 77 years of disappeared families pressing down on me like the darkness between houses. I pulled out Emma Morrison's drawing and looked at it again. The stick figure with the wide staring eyes and the open mouth. The words at the bottom, "He lives in the walls now." Not he, them, all of them. Hundreds of children and their families, existing in the spaces between moments, calling to new families to join their eternal games. And me, standing alone in my kitchen at 3 a.m, listening to their voices and understanding finally what Mrs. Henderson had been trying to tell us that night in her living room. Don't let them find you. But they had found me. They had found Sarah. They had found everyone who had ever responded to a call at 1247 Elmwood Avenue. The question now was how long I could hold them back before the weight of their voices broke my heart the way it had broken hers. The scratching was getting louder. Sarah called me at 4:17 a.m., 3 days after I'd stood in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen watching the Blackwood family disappear into the walls. Her voice was shaking, barely above a whisper. "Mike, I need you to come to my apartment. Something's wrong." I'd been sitting in my recliner, hadn't slept in 36 hours, listening to the sounds moving through my walls like a migration of something that had never been alive. The voices had been getting clearer, more distinct. I could make out individual words now, fragments of conversations between children who had been playing the same games for decades. What kind of wrong? Just, please. 1247 Oak Street, apartment 3B. And Mike, don't use the front entrance. Come up the fire escape. The line went dead. Oak Street, 4 blocks from Elmwood Avenue, 6 blocks from Cedar Lane where the Kowalski family had vanished. I was beginning to understand that geography mattered in ways I'd never considered before. That there were invisible lines connecting these houses, these disappearances, these spaces where families went to play games that never ended. I drove through empty streets, past houses where normal people slept normal sleep, dreaming normal dreams. People who would wake up in a few hours and go to work and come home and never know that something was hunting in their neighborhood, calling to their children from the spaces between walls. Sarah's apartment building was a converted Victorian, the kind of place where young cops lived when they were starting out. saving money for houses in safer neighborhoods. The fire escape was rusty and protested every step, but it held my weight as I climbed to the 3rd floor. Sarah was waiting at the window, still in her uniform from the previous shift. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wild, the look of someone who hadn't slept in days. "Thank God," she said, helping me through the window. I didn't know who else to call. Her apartment was small, neat, the kind of place that said its occupant was rarely home. But something was wrong with the proportions. The living room seemed too long, the kitchen too narrow, as if the walls had shifted when no one was looking. "Sarah, what's happening?" She led me to the bedroom, pointed at the wall behind her bed. The drywall was torn open in several places, holes big enough for a person to crawl through. Insulation hung out like exposed organs, and I could see into the space between the walls. "It started 2 nights ago," she said. "Scratching, you know the sound. But it was different this time, more purposeful, like someone was trying to build something." I approached the largest hole, shined my flashlight into the gap between the studs. What I saw made my breath catch. Someone had been building tunnels. Not just random holes, but carefully constructed pathways that led from Sarah's bedroom wall to other apartments, other rooms, other buildings. The tunnels were lined with children's drawings, hundreds of them, showing the same thing over and over. Families holding hands, walking through doorways that led to spaces that couldn't exist. "How long has this been going on?" "Since the Henderson call, since that night we found her in the chair." Sarah's voice cracked. I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it was stress or PTSD or whatever the department shrink wanted to call it. But they're not in my head, Mike. They're in my walls. I could hear them now, the voices of children echoing through the tunnel system. Not just Sarah's apartment, but the entire building, maybe the entire block. They were singing again, that same nursery rhyme, but the words were different now. "Ring around the building, pocket full of families, tunnels, tunnels, we all crawl down." "We have to get you out of here," I said. But when I turned toward the window, it was gone. The wall was solid, unbroken, as if there had never been a fire escape, never been a way in or out. "I tried leaving," Sarah said quietly. "Every night for 3 days, I've tried to leave. But the apartment won't let me. The doors lead to other apartments, other buildings, other places where families used to live." She was right. The front door of her apartment opened onto a hallway I'd never seen before, lined with doors that led to rooms that shouldn't exist. Each door had a nameplate: Blackwood, Ashford, Gregory, Morrison, Kowalski. Names I recognized from missing persons reports, from families that had vanished from houses throughout the Millbrook district. "They're building something," Sarah continued, "using the tunnels, the spaces between buildings, connecting all the places where families disappeared, creating some kind of network." I thought about the drawing in my pocket, about Emma Morrison's careful handwriting. He lives in the walls now. Not he, they. All of them, working together, building pathways between the real world and whatever space they inhabited. "The question is why," I said. The answer came from behind us, in the voice of a child who had been dead for 77 years. "Because it's almost time for the gathering." We turned to find Mary Blackwood standing in Sarah's bedroom, wearing the same dress she'd died in, her face pale and wrong, in the way that faces become when they've been dead too long. Every 77 years, we call a gathering. All the families, all the children, everyone who's ever heard the voices and followed them into the walls. We come together in the space between spaces, and we choose someone new to watch. "Mrs. Henderson," I said. Mary nodded. She watched for us, kept our secret, made sure we could keep playing our games without interference. But she got old, got tired, and her heart couldn't carry the weight anymore. So you killed her. We loved her, Mary said, and for a moment her face looked almost human. She was the best watcher we ever had. She understood that families should stay together, that children should never have to grow up and leave their parents behind. The tunnels around us were filling with voices now, dozens of them, hundreds of them. Children calling to their parents, parents calling to their children, all of them moving through the spaces between walls like blood through arteries. You've seen us now, Mary continued. You've heard us, understood us. You know what we are and what we need. You can be the new watcher, the one who keeps our secret and makes sure we can keep calling to new families. And if I refuse? Her smile was terrible, full of too many teeth that weren't really teeth. Then you can join us. You and Officer Chen can play games with us forever, and we'll find someone else to watch. Someone who won't resist as long, won't fight as hard. I looked at Sarah, saw the decision forming in her eyes. She was thinking about it, considering the offer. 77 years of carrying the weight of disappeared families, of listening to children's voices in the walls, of slowly going insane from the responsibility, or eternity playing games that never ended with children who never grew up. There's a third option, I said. Mary Blackwood tilted her head, curious. We tell people, we break the pattern. We make sure everyone knows what's hunting in Millbrook. Her laughter was like broken glass. Who would believe you? Who would listen to two cops who've been seeing things, hearing voices, filing reports about impossible events? You'd be committed, medicated, forgotten, and we'd still be here, calling to children from the walls. She was right, and we both knew it. The department had already written us off as stress cases, had already explained away everything we'd experienced. Who would believe that families were disappearing into spaces between walls, that children were building tunnels through the infrastructure of reality itself? But as I stood there in Sarah's impossible apartment, listening to the voices of the dead echoing through tunnels that couldn't exist, I realized something that Mrs. Henderson had probably realized 74 years ago. It didn't matter if anyone believed us. What mattered was that someone remembered. Someone kept count. Someone carried the weight of their names and their faces and their last moments before they heard the calling and followed it into the spaces between breathing and not breathing. I'll do it, I said. Sarah looked at me with relief and something that might have been gratitude. Mary Blackwood clapped her hands together like the child she'd been before she died. Wonderful. You'll make an excellent watcher. Mrs. Henderson said you would. But I have conditions. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Mary's expression shifted, became something predatory and ancient. Conditions. I'll watch. I'll keep your secret. I'll carry the weight of every family you take. But you leave Sarah alone. You stop calling to her. Stop building tunnels in her walls. Stop trying to drag her into whatever space you inhabit. And why would we agree to that? I pulled Emma Morrison's drawing from my pocket, held it up so Mary could see it. Her eyes widened, fixed on the careful crayon lines, the stick figures, the words at the bottom. Because I have something that belongs to you, something that connects me to all of them, all the families, all the children. Emma Morrison drew this picture and somehow got it into my walls before she disappeared. Which means she knew I was coming, knew I would be the next watcher. Mary reached for the drawing, but I pulled it back. This stays with me, as long as I have it. As long as I remember Emma and Michael and their parents and everyone else who heard your calling, you have power in the real world. But if anything happens to Sarah, if you take her into the walls, I destroy this drawing. And without it, without that connection to the real world, you're just voices in the dark." It was a bluff, and I wasn't even sure it was a good one. But Mary Blackwood stepped back, considered my words with the calculating intelligence of something far older than the 8-year-old girl she appeared to be. "Agreed," she said finally. "Officer Chen will be left alone. But you, Detective Walsh, belong to us now. You'll watch for us, remember for us, carry our names until your heart breaks from the weight of them." The tunnels around us began to collapse, the walls shifting back to their proper positions. Sarah's apartment returned to normal proportions, and the window reappeared, showing the fire escape and the street 3 stories below. 77 years, Mary said, already beginning to fade. Or until you can't carry the weight anymore, whichever comes first. Then she was gone, and Sarah and I were alone in her bedroom with holes in the walls that would need explaining to her landlord. "Mike," Sarah said quietly, "thank you." But I wasn't sure she should be thanking me. I wasn't sure either of us understood what I'd just agreed to, what price I'd just promised to pay. Outside, dawn was breaking over Millbrook, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of children laughing. The sound of children who would never grow up, playing games that would never end, in spaces that existed between the real and the remembered. And now it was my job to listen to them, to remember them, to carry their weight, for 77 years, or until my heart broke from the responsibility, whichever came first. The first family disappeared 2 weeks after I made my deal with Mary Blackwood. The Hendersons, no relation to Dorothy, lived at 892 Pine Street in a craftsman bungalow with a front porch swing and rose bushes that had been blooming for 40 years. James Henderson was a machinist at the tool factory. His wife Carol taught piano lessons from their living room, and their daughter Sophie was 5 years old with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. I knew they were gone before the call came in. I'd been sitting in my patrol car outside the elementary school, watching children play during recess, when I felt it. A shift in the air, a change in the quality of light, like the moment before a thunderstorm when every animal in the forest goes silent. The scratching in my own walls had stopped 3 days earlier, replaced by a different sound. The soft whisper of children's voices moving through spaces that shouldn't exist, carrying news from one house to another. The call came at 2:47 p.m. Neighbor reported the Henderson house had been quiet for 2 days, mail piling up, piano lessons canceled without explanation. I took the call alone. Sarah had transferred to the day shift in the downtown precinct, as far from Millbrook as she could get while staying on the force. She'd stopped returning my calls, stopped acknowledging me when we passed in the hallways. I understood. She was trying to forget, trying to pretend that none of it had happened. I envied her that luxury. The Henderson house looked normal from the outside. Newspaper on the walkway, lights on inside. The kind of place where nothing terrible should ever happen. But I could feel them watching from the windows. Not the Hendersons, but the others. The children who lived in the walls, who had been calling to Sophie Henderson for weeks. The front door was unlocked. Inside, everything was exactly as it should be except for the silence. No television, no radio, no sound of a 5-year-old girl playing with her toys. Just the heavy quiet that follows after voices stop calling and families stop answering. I found them in Sophie's bedroom. The wall behind her bed had been opened from the inside, carefully carved away to create a doorway just large enough for a family to walk through single file. James Henderson's work clothes were folded neatly on Sophie's dresser. Carol's wedding ring sat on the nightstand next to a half-finished glass of water, and on the pillow, written in a child's careful handwriting, was a note. We went to play with the children in the walls. Don't worry about us. Time doesn't hurt here. I stared at that note for a long time, holding it in my hands that were already beginning to shake. The first entry in what I knew would become a very long ledger. The first family whose names I would carry, whose faces I would remember, whose disappearance would become my responsibility. I sealed the house, filed the report, attended the meetings where other detectives discussed possibilities: kidnapping, murder-suicide, witness protection. I nodded at the right times, made the right sounds, and never mentioned the doorway in the wall, or the note on the pillow, or the voices I could hear singing lullabies in the spaces between rooms. That night, I started the list. Henderson, James, 34, machinist Henderson. Carol, 31, piano teacher Henderson. Sophie, 5, kindergarten student. I wrote their names in a composition notebook I bought at the drugstore, along with the date they disappeared and everything I could remember about them. It seemed important to get the details right, to make sure they were remembered as real people who had lived real lives before they heard the calling. The voices in my walls were pleased. I could hear them whispering approval as I wrote, their scratching taking on an almost musical quality. They liked having a watcher again, someone to keep their records, someone to bear witness to their endless games. Mrs. Henderson had done this for 74 years. 74 years of names and dates and families who trusted their children to lead them somewhere safe. I tried to imagine the weight of it, the accumulated grief of decades of disappearances. No wonder her heart had finally given out. The second family vanished 3 weeks later. The Williamses from Oak Street, David, a bank teller, Jennifer, a nurse, their twin boys Marcus and Matthew, age 7. Their house was found empty, except for a sandbox in the backyard where someone had built an elaborate castle with towers and walls and tiny windows. When I looked closer, I could see that the castle was actually a scale model of the entire Millbrook neighborhood, complete with miniature houses and streets and small figures that looked suspiciously like the families who had disappeared. Williams, David, 29, bank teller Williams, Jennifer, 27, registered nurse Williams, Marcus, 7, second grade, Williams, Matthew, 7, second grade. The list grew longer. Thompson family in November. Parents, Sarah and Michael. Daughter Emma, age 6, found their house empty except for crayon drawings on every wall showing the same thing. Children holding hands in a circle, dancing around something that might have been a house, or might have been a doorway, or might have been the mouth of something too large to see completely. Rodriguez family in December. Father Luis, Mother Maria, son Carlos, age 8, daughter Isabella, age 5. Their house smelled of birthday cake when I entered it, and there was evidence of a party in the living room. Balloons, streamers, a cake with 5 candles that had burned down to nothing. But no people. Just a video camera still recording, showing 6 hours of an empty room where phantom voices sang "Happy Birthday" to a child who was no longer there. Each time, I added their names to the list. Each time, I felt the weight of responsibility settling deeper into my bones. And each time, the voices in the walls grew stronger, more confident, more numerous. By spring, I could hear entire conversations. Children describing the games they played in the spaces between houses, parents discussing the strange geography of their new home, families planning reunions with relatives who had disappeared decades earlier. They spoke of time differently there. Years that passed like minutes, minutes that stretched like years, seasons that changed according to the wishes of the children rather than the rotation of the earth. Linda left me in March. I don't blame her. I'd become someone she didn't recognize, someone who sat up all night writing in a notebook, someone who talked to empty rooms and jumped at every shadow. Someone who kept a list of missing families in his nightstand drawer and muttered their names like prayers. "I don't know who you are anymore," she said as she packed her bags. "It's like you're not really here, like you're living somewhere else." She was more right than she knew. The department put me on administrative leave in April, after I was found standing in the middle of Cedar Lane at 3 a.m, staring at a house that had been demolished 2 months earlier. I tried to explain that I could still see the family inside. The Morrison twins playing in their bedroom, their parents reading bedtime stories that would never end. But explanations only made things worse. Dr. Morrison, the psychologist, not the detective, increased my sessions to twice a week. She prescribed medication that I pretended to take, recommended treatments that I politely declined. She was concerned about my isolation, my obsessive note-taking, my insistence on patrolling neighborhoods that weren't even my beat anymore. "Detective Walsh," she said during one session, "I'm seeing signs of what we call intrusive thought patterns. You're experiencing guilt and responsibility for events that are completely outside your control." If only it were that simple. The truth was that I could control it to some extent. The families that disappeared were the ones I failed to reach in time, the ones I couldn't warn or protect or save. Every name in my notebook represented a moment when I'd been too slow, too late, too human to prevent the calling from reaching its target. But there were also the ones I'd saved, the families I'd managed to reach before the voices found them, before the tunnels opened in their walls, before their children started drawing pictures of doorways that led to spaces between spaces. I couldn't tell Dr. Morrison about those successes, couldn't explain how I knew which houses to watch, which families were at risk. I couldn't tell her about the network I was building. Former residents of Millbrook who had moved away, but still called to report strange sounds in their new homes, teachers who noticed when children started drawing the same disturbing pictures, social workers who saw patterns in family disappearances that the official statistics missed. By summer, I had contacts in 17 states and 3 countries. People who had witnessed something they couldn't explain, who had lost families to circumstances that made no sense, who had heard children singing in walls that should have been empty. We shared information carefully, coded messages that looked like routine correspondence but actually tracked the movement of something ancient and hungry as it spread beyond Millbrook into the wider world. Because that was the thing Mrs. Henderson had never told me, the thing Mary Blackwood had failed to mention during our agreement. The calling wasn't limited to one neighborhood anymore. It was growing, expanding, finding new houses and new families and new children to add to its collection. What had started as a localized phenomenon in Millbrook was becoming something larger, something that crossed state lines and international borders, something that fed on the fundamental human need for family, for belonging, for children who would never have to grow up and leave their parents behind. And I was the only one keeping track of it all. The weight of it was incredible. Not just the families from Millbrook, but families from Portland and Phoenix and Pittsburgh, from Toronto and London and Sydney. Children from every continent except Antarctica, all of them hearing the same calling, all of them leading their families into spaces that existed between the real and the remembered. My notebook had become notebooks, plural, dozens of them, filled with names and dates and locations, cross-referenced and color-coded and organized according to patterns that took me months to recognize. The calling moved in cycles, roughly following the school year. September through November saw the most activity, as children returned to routines that made them more susceptible to voices from elsewhere. December and January were quieter. The calling seemed to respect the traditional family gatherings of the holidays, waiting until those bonds were strongest before exploiting them. Spring brought a surge of activity as the weather warmed, and children spent more time playing outdoors, in basements, in the kinds of spaces where walls were thinner and voices could travel more easily. Summer was unpredictable, sometimes quiet, sometimes explosive, depending on factors I was still trying to understand. But the pattern that frightened me most was the geographical spread. What had taken 77 years to claim dozens of families in Millbrook was now claiming hundreds of families worldwide in a matter of months. The calling was learning, adapting, finding more efficient ways to reach children and convince families to follow them into the spaces between, and I was running out of time to figure out how to stop it. The scratching in my walls had changed over the months, becoming more complex, more structured. It wasn't random anymore. It was language, communication, a way for the children in the walls to share information about new hunting grounds, new families, new opportunities to expand their eternal games. Sometimes, late at night, when I was updating my notebooks, I could hear Mary Blackwood's voice among the others. She was older now, somehow, more mature despite being eternally 8 years old. The responsibility of leading the calling had changed her, given her an authority that the other children deferred to. "You're doing well, Detective Walsh," she would whisper through the spaces between my walls and the world. "Mrs. Henderson would be proud. You're keeping such careful records, remembering so many names." "How many more?" I would ask. "As many as it takes," she would answer. "As many as we need to fill all the empty spaces, all the forgotten rooms, all the places where families should be but aren't." "What happens when there are no more families left to call?" Her laughter was like wind chimes made of bone. "Then we start over, of course, in a new world with new children, new families who have never heard our songs." The calling is patient, Detective Walsh. It has been waiting much longer than you realize. By autumn, my notebooks filled an entire closet. Thousands of names, hundreds of locations, patterns and connections that painted a picture of something vast and patient and utterly alien in its hunger for human connection. And still the list grew longer. Every night more families, every week more cities, every month more evidence that what I had thought was a local problem was actually a global phenomenon that had been building for much longer than 77 years. The question wasn't how to stop it anymore. The question was whether I could carry the weight of every disappearing family in the world without following Mrs. Henderson into cardiac arrest from the sheer impossibility of remembering them all. The scratching in my wall suggested I was going to find out very soon. By the 1-year anniversary of that first night in Mrs. Henderson's house, I had documented 2,847 disappearances across 6 continents. The notebooks had taken over my entire apartment. Filing cabinets lined the walls, maps covered every surface, red string connected pushpins and patterns that would have looked like madness to anyone who didn't understand what they were tracking. But the strangest thing wasn't the numbers. It was the letters. They started arriving in January, addressed to the Watcher in children's handwriting, postmarked from cities where families had vanished. At first, I thought they were hoaxes, cruel jokes from people who had somehow learned about my investigation. But the details were too specific, too accurate, too intimate to be anything but genuine. "Dear Watcher," the first one read, "My name is Emma Morrison, and I wanted to thank you for remembering us. It gets lonely sometimes in the spaces between, even with all the other families here, but knowing that someone in the real world still knows our names, still writes them down and thinks about us, makes the games more fun. Tell my teacher, Mrs. Patterson, that I finished the drawing she asked us to do. It's a picture of our new house. I think she would like it here." The letter was accompanied by a crayon drawing that showed impossible architecture. Rooms, connected by tunnels, staircases that led to other staircases, windows that looked out onto other windows in an endless recursion of nested spaces. And in every room, stick figures of families holding hands, playing games that had no apparent rules or endpoints. More letters followed. Children thanking me for keeping their records straight. Parents expressing gratitude that someone remembered their last moments in the real world. Entire families sending group messages written in different handwriting on the same piece of paper. The Postal Service delivered them without question, despite the fact that the return addresses were houses that no longer existed, apartments that had been demolished, rooms that had never been built. Somehow, the letters found their way from the spaces between to my mailbox, carrying news from a place that existed outside the normal flow of time and space. "Dear Watcher," wrote Tommy Blackwood, the first child to disappear from Millbrook in 1941. "Mary says to tell you that the gathering is going well. We have almost enough families now to fill the great room, the one that connects all the houses to all the other houses. Grandfather Ashford says he remembers when there were only a few dozen of us, back when the calling was weak and could only reach one family at a time. Now, we are thousands, and the calling grows stronger every day. Soon, we will be strong enough to call to everyone at once, all the children in all the world, and then no family will ever have to be separated again." I read that letter 17 times before I understood what it meant. The gathering wasn't just a reunion of the families that had already disappeared. It was preparation for something larger, something that would end the need for individual callings, individual disappearances, individual choices about whether to follow the voices into the walls. They were planning to call every child in the world at the same time. I tried to warn people. I wrote letters to police departments, to newspapers, to government agencies that dealt with missing persons cases. I sent copies of the evidence, photos of the impossible letters, transcripts of the voices in the walls, detailed analyses of the disappearance patterns. Every letter came back marked "Return to Sender" or "Addressee Unknown." Phone calls went unanswered or were transferred to voicemail systems that never called back. Email addresses bounced back with error messages that made no technical sense. It was as if the outside world had developed a blind spot, an inability to perceive or process information about the calling. The children in the walls had learned to protect themselves, to edit reality around the edges so that their existence remained invisible to anyone who might be able to stop them. Everyone except the Watchers. Because there were others, I discovered. Other people like me, in other cities, carrying the weight of disappeared families and trying to track patterns that grew more complex by the day. We found each other through coded messages, through references in old police reports, through the terrible recognition that comes from meeting someone else who has seen too much and remembered too much and carried too much. Dr. Margaret Chen in Vancouver, no relation to Sarah, had been watching for 6 years. Her beat was the Pacific Northwest, tracking families that vanished from houses built on land that had been forest for centuries. She specialized in the environmental factors, the way the calling seemed to prefer places where the boundary between civilization and wilderness was thin. Detective Raymond Torres in Phoenix had been keeping records for 4 years, focusing on suburban communities where the architecture itself seemed to invite the calling. Planned neighborhoods with identical houses, identical yards, identical families living identical lives, until the children started hearing voices and leading their parents into spaces that existed between the real and the planned. Agent Lisa Morrison in London, no relation to the detective or the psychologist, worked for a government department that officially didn't exist, tracking disappearances that connected to similar cases across Europe. She had files going back to the 1800s, evidence that the calling had been active for much longer than any of us had suspected. We shared information carefully, using methods that the children in the walls hadn't learned to intercept yet. Dead drops in abandoned buildings, messages hidden in classified ads, coded references in academic papers about folklore and urban legends. Slowly, painstakingly, we built a picture of something vast and patient and utterly devoted to the idea that families should never be separated. The global pattern was clear once you knew how to look for it. The calling moved in waves, starting in areas where family structures were strongest. Small towns, traditional communities, places where children still trusted their parents, and parents still believed in protecting their children. It fed on that trust, used it as a pathway into the real world, converting the bonds that held families together into chains that dragged them into spaces between spaces. From those strongholds, it spread to cities, to suburbs, to any place where children played and parents worried, and families gathered around dinner tables to share the events of their days. It was democratic in its hunger. Race, religion, nationality, social class, none of it mattered. What mattered was the strength of the bonds between parents and children, the willingness of families to follow their children anywhere, even into spaces that couldn't exist. But there were rules, patterns we could identify and sometimes exploit. The calling was strongest during times of family stress, moves to new houses, divorces, deaths of grandparents, any disruption that made children more vulnerable to voices that promised permanence, stability, eternal togetherness. It was weakest when families were scattered, parents traveling for work, children at summer camps, extended relatives living far apart. We started a network, unofficial, invisible, off the books. Social workers who knew which warning signs to look for. Teachers who understood that certain types of children's drawings meant immediate intervention was necessary. Postal workers who could identify letters from impossible addresses and redirect them to watchers instead of delivering them to vulnerable families. It wasn't enough to stop the calling, but it was enough to slow it down, to save some families, to give some children a chance to grow up in the real world instead of playing eternal games in the spaces between. The children in the walls noticed. The letters became more frequent, more insistent. Mary Blackwood's voice in my walls took on an edge of frustration, of impatience with my interference. "You're not supposed to fight us, Detective Walsh," she said one night as I updated my records. "You're supposed to watch, to remember, to carry our names." Mrs. Henderson understood that. She never tried to stop us. Mrs. Henderson didn't know how big this was going to get, I replied to the darkness. She thought you were local, contained. She didn't know you were planning to call every child in the world. The world is full of lonely families, Detective Walsh. Parents who work too much, children who spend too much time alone, homes where people live together but never really connect. We offer them something better. We offer them forever. You offer them death. We offer them transformation, transcendence, freedom from the boundaries that keep families apart. Her voice was getting older, more sophisticated, carrying the weight of decades spent converting human connection into something else entirely. Time, space, distance, death. These things don't exist in the spaces between. Families can be together always, exactly as they were in their happiest moments. But they're not really together. They're not really anything. They're more together than they ever were in the real world. More connected, more complete. They exist as pure love, pure family, pure belonging. Isn't that what every parent wants for their children? Isn't that what every child dreams of? I thought about Emma Morrison's letters, about the joy in her crayon drawings, about the evident happiness of families who had found their way into the spaces between. Maybe Mary was right. Maybe what they offered was better than the alternative. Growing up, growing apart, growing old, losing the people you loved to time and distance, and the inevitable entropy of human connection. But I also thought about the families I'd managed to save. Children who were now teenagers, struggling with homework and first crushes, and all the messy complications of growing up in the real world. Parents who worried about college tuition and job security and whether they were raising their children right. Normal problems, human problems, real problems. The scratching in my walls was getting more aggressive, more demanding. The children had been patient with me for almost a year, but their patience was wearing thin. The gathering was almost complete, and they needed their watcher to stop interfering and start accepting. "You can't save them all, Detective Walsh," Mary said. "You can't even save most of them. The calling is too strong now, too widespread. Soon it will reach every child at once, and then your little network of watchers won't matter anymore." "When?" "Soon. When the great room is ready, when all the houses are connected, when the spaces between become larger than the spaces within. Halloween, Detective Walsh. The night when the boundary between worlds is thinnest, when children are already thinking about transformation and masks and becoming something other than what they are. Halloween. 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to figure out how to stop something that had been building for almost a century. Something that had learned to edit reality around the edges and make itself invisible to anyone who might have the power to intervene. 6 weeks to save every child in the world from voices that promised them forever. The scratching in my walls had become a countdown, marking the days and hours until the great calling would begin. And I was the only person who knew it was coming. The only person who understood what was at stake. The weight of every disappeared family had been crushing enough. The weight of every family that was about to disappear might be enough to kill me. But if I didn't carry it, who would? The children in the walls were counting on me to give up, to accept their vision of forever, to stop fighting and start watching as they called every child in the world to join their eternal games. I pulled out a fresh notebook and started writing new names. Not the names of families who had already disappeared, but the names of children who were still here, still real, still growing up in a world where families could be messy and complicated and beautifully, imperfectly human. Those were the names I was going to fight for. The first sign that something had fundamentally changed came on October 13th, 2 weeks before Halloween. I was monitoring police scanners from 17 cities when they all went silent at exactly 11:47 p.m. The same time we'd first received the call about Mrs. Henderson 1 year earlier. For exactly 17 minutes, not a single emergency call was reported across North America. No domestic disputes, no traffic accidents, no break-ins or overdoses or heart attacks. Just absolute silence from communication systems that never stopped carrying the white noise of human crisis. Then, at 12:04 a.m., the calls resumed. But something was different. The dispatchers' voices carried an odd echo, a harmonic distortion that made every transmission sound like it was coming from inside a tunnel. And underneath the normal chatter about patrol assignments and incident reports, you could hear it if you listened carefully. Children singing. Ring around the planet, pocket full of families, tunnels, tunnels. We all fall down. The other watchers noticed it too. Dr. Chen called from Vancouver to report that her police scanner was picking up transmissions from precincts that had been demolished years ago. Detective Torres in Phoenix documented emergency calls that were being answered by dispatchers who had died in the 1980s. Agent Morrison in London recorded radio chatter in languages that didn't exist, describing crimes that had never been committed in places that had never been built. The children in the walls were taking control of our communication systems. preparing to broadcast the calling on every frequency simultaneously. Halloween was still 2 weeks away, but they were already testing their ability to reach every child in the world at the same time. I tried calling the FBI, the CDC, the Department of Homeland Security. Every number I dialed connected me to the same voice, a cheerful receptionist who sounded exactly like Mary Blackwood. "I'm sorry," she would say, "but that department has been discontinued. Can I transfer you to our new family reunification services? They specialize in bringing loved ones together permanently." The children had been busy during the year I'd been watching them. They hadn't just been collecting families, they'd been learning how our world worked, how our systems connected, how our infrastructure could be turned against us. They understood now that the real world was held together by networks of communication and trust, and they were systematically corrupting both. My contact with the other watchers became sporadic, then impossible. Phone calls connected to dead air or recordings of children's laughter. Emails bounced back with error messages written in crayon. The coded messages we'd hidden in classified ads were replaced by recruitment notices for something called the Forever Family Foundation, promising eternal togetherness for parents and children who were tired of growing apart. By October 20th, I was completely isolated. The last watcher, as far as I could tell, still operating in the real world. The others had either been cut off like me, or they'd given up and accepted the calling themselves. I had no way to know which. The voices in my walls were constant now, no longer limiting themselves to nighttime whispers. They spoke openly during the day, discussing preparations for the great calling with the casual efficiency of event planners organizing a wedding. "The transmission arrays are aligned," Mary Blackwood announced during one of their morning briefings. "Every radio, every television, every cell phone, every device that can carry sound will broadcast our song simultaneously. No child will be able to avoid hearing it." "What about the parents?" asked another voice, one I didn't recognize. "The adults who might try to stop their children from answering. The song will affect them too," Mary replied. "Not the same way. Adults are too closed off, too skeptical to hear the calling directly. But they'll feel the pull, the need to follow their children wherever they lead. Family bonds work both ways, after all." I spent my days trying to reach anyone who might listen, anyone who might be able to help. But the children had been thorough in their corruption of communication systems. Every call I made, every message I sent, every attempt to warn the outside world was intercepted and redirected. The only people who could still receive my communications were the families the children had already marked for collection. My warnings reached them clearly, but only strengthened their eventual decision to follow their children into the spaces between. They interpreted my frantic calls and letters as confirmation that something wonderful was about to happen, something that would unite all families forever. On October 25th, 6 days before Halloween, the children made their final preparations visible. Every house in Millbrook where a family had disappeared now showed lights in the windows again. Not electric lights, something older, warmer, more organic. If you looked carefully, you could see figures moving behind the glass. Families reunited in their original homes, playing games that cast shadows on the walls. But the shadows were wrong. They moved independently of the figures that cast them, reaching across the glass to touch the shadows of trees, of other houses, of the real world itself. The entire neighborhood was becoming networked, connected by shadow tunnels that linked every space where families had once lived to every space where families still remained. The scratching in my walls evolved into something more complex, a rhythmic tapping that I slowly realized was Morse code. The children were sending technical specifications to each other, coordinates and frequencies and timing sequences for the Great Calling. They wanted me to understand what they were planning, wanted me to appreciate the elegance of their solution to the problem of human separation. On October 28th, 3 days before the calling, I received one final letter. Not from the children this time, but from Mrs. Henderson herself. Dear Detective Walsh, it read in her familiar handwriting, I want you to know how proud I am of the work you've done this year. You've carried the weight better than I ever did, remembered more names, saved more families, but now it's time to let go. The children aren't evil, you know. They're not monsters or demons or anything supernatural. They're just lonely. They've been lonely for so long, existing in the spaces between moments, watching families grow apart and children grow up and parents grow old. They want what we all want. Connection, belonging, love that doesn't fade with time. Tomorrow night, every child in the world will hear their song, and every child will have to choose between growing up in a world where families eventually break apart, or staying forever in a place where love is permanent and connection is absolute. Most of them will choose forever. How could they not? What child wouldn't want to play eternal games with parents who never get tired, siblings who never fight, grandparents who never die? The ones who choose to stay in the real world will grow up to become the new watchers. They'll remember the families who chose forever, keep their names, carry their weight. The cycle will begin again, but gentler this time, kinder, with less separation between the watchers and the watched. You've done your job, Detective Walsh. You've kept our names, remembered our faces, carried our weight until your heart nearly broke from the responsibility. Now, let someone else carry it for a while. Come home, come play with us, come be part of a family that will never have to say goodbye. The letter was signed not just by Mrs. Henderson, but by every family I'd documented over the past year. Hundreds of signatures, thousands of names, all the people I'd watched disappear into the spaces between. All of them inviting me to join them. On October 30th, the day before Halloween, I made my decision. I gathered all my notebooks, all my records, all the evidence I'd collected over the past year. I loaded them into my car and drove to the Millbrook Public Library, where I used their photocopier to make dozens of copies of everything. Then I mailed the copies to addresses I'd memorized: police departments, newspapers, government agencies, random people whose names I'd picked from phone books. Most of the packages would never arrive, I knew. The children would intercept them, redirect them, ensure that their great calling happened without interference. But maybe a few would get through. Maybe someone, somewhere, would receive the evidence and understand what it meant, and be ready to become the next watcher when the cycle began again. After that, I drove home and sat in my living room, surrounded by the sound of children's voices in the walls, and waited for Halloween to begin. At exactly midnight on October 31st, every communication device in the world began broadcasting the same signal. Not just radios and televisions and cell phones, but also baby monitors and intercoms and electronic toys and anything else that could carry sound. The great calling had begun, and for the first time in over a year, I heard it clearly. Not the distorted echoes that had been leaking through walls and radios, but the actual song the children had been preparing for so long. It was beautiful. It was a lullaby and a hymn and a promise all wrapped together, sung by thousands of children's voices in perfect harmony. It spoke of families reunited, of love that transcended time and space, of games that never ended and connections that never broke. Every child in the world was hearing it now, and every child was making the same choice their siblings had made before them. Most of them said yes. I could feel it happening. Families all over the world walking through doorways that shouldn't exist, following their children into spaces between the real and the remembered. The walls of my house began to glow with warm light. and I could see openings forming, passages that led to rooms where familiar faces were waiting. Emma Morrison stood in one doorway, still 8 years old, still holding her crayons, but somehow older and wiser and infinitely patient. "Are you ready, Detective Walsh?" she asked. "Are you ready to come home?" I thought about Linda, who had left me because I'd become someone she didn't recognize. I thought about Sarah, who had transferred to the day shift and tried to forget everything we'd experienced together. I thought about the thousands of families whose names filled my notebooks, whose weight I'd been carrying for a year. I thought about the children who had chosen to stay in the real world, the ones who would grow up to become watchers themselves, the ones who would carry the next iteration of names and faces and disappeared families. The cycle would continue. It always did. There would always be someone to remember, someone to watch, someone to carry the weight. Just not me anymore. I stood up from my chair, walked toward the doorway where Emma Morrison was waiting, and stepped through into a space that existed between heartbeats, between breaths, between the moment when families are together and the moment when they begin to grow apart. Behind me, my notebooks remained scattered across the living room floor, filled with names and dates and stories that someone else would find eventually. Someone else would read them, understand them, and pick up the weight I was finally setting down. The cycle would begin again. But for now, for the first time in over a year, I was going to play games that never ended with families that never had to say goodbye. The scratching in the walls had stopped, because I was the one making it now. The real world discovered my notebooks on November 3rd, 3 days after Halloween, when my landlord entered the apartment to investigate reports of strange sounds coming from the walls. By then, an estimated 847 million children worldwide had vanished overnight, along with their families, in what the media was calling the Great Disappearance. Detective Sarah Chen, she'd taken my name when she got married, a coincidence that felt less like chance and more like inevitability, was assigned to investigate my apartment. She stood in my living room, surrounded by filing cabinets and maps in red string, reading the names I'd written in careful handwriting over the course of a year. "Jesus Christ, Mike," she whispered to the empty room. "What did you figure out?" The notebooks told the story chronologically, from that first night in Mrs. Henderson's house to the final entry I'd made on October 30th. Sarah read them all, working through the night, occasionally stopping to stare at the walls when she heard sounds that reminded her of scratching fingernails. She understood, better than anyone else could, what the evidence meant. She'd been there for the beginning, had seen Mrs. Henderson turn her dead eyes toward us, had run through that impossible hallway lined with shifting photographs. She knew I hadn't been losing my mind. She knew I'd been documenting something real. By morning, she'd made the same decision I had made a year earlier. She was going to become the next watcher. The Great Disappearance had broken every system humanity had built for processing mass casualties. Governments collapsed under the weight of trying to track 847 million missing persons reports filed simultaneously. Economic markets crashed when nearly a quarter of the global workforce simply vanished. Religious institutions split between those who saw it as rapture and those who interpreted it as judgment. But in the chaos, certain patterns became visible to people who knew how to look for them. Sarah assembled a new network of watchers from the survivors, police officers who had lost their partners, teachers whose entire classrooms had emptied overnight, parents whose children had chosen to stay in the real world while their siblings had followed the calling. People who understood that something vast and patient had just achieved its largest victory, but who also understood that it wasn't finished, because children were still being born, families were still forming, and somewhere in the spaces between the real and the remembered, 847 million voices were singing lullabies that could be heard by anyone who knew how to listen. The children in the walls had gotten what they wanted. The largest gathering in their history. Enough families to fill every empty space, every forgotten room, every place where love could exist without the constraints of time or distance. But they'd also learned something important about the real world. It was resilient. It adapted. It found ways to continue even after unimaginable loss. Sarah's first case came 2 weeks after the Great Disappearance. A family in Sacramento, the Washingtons, parents David and Marie, daughter Kelly, age 7, had reported strange sounds in their walls. Not scratching this time, but something that sounded like children playing hide-and-seek, counting down from 10 in voices that echoed from impossible distances. Sarah arrived at their house with equipment I'd never had access to. Electromagnetic field detectors, thermal imaging cameras, audio recording devices sensitive enough to pick up whispers from several rooms away. The new generation of watchers was better equipped, better trained, better prepared for what they might encounter. But they were also fewer in number. Where there had once been thousands of families in neighborhoods like Millbrook, there were now dozens scattered across entire cities. The children in the walls had been thorough in their collection, taking not just the families who heard the calling directly, but also the neighbors who might have interfered, the teachers who might have recognized the warning signs, the social workers who might have known how to intervene. What remained was a world where most people had lost someone to the Great Disappearance, where everyone had a theory about what had happened, but no one had proof, where children's drawings of doorways and tunnels were carefully monitored by parents who didn't understand what they were looking for, but knew they should be afraid. Sarah saved the Washington family. She arrived in time to hear the countdown in their walls, in time to evacuate them before the doorways opened, in time to document the exact moment when their house tried to transform itself into something that existed between the real and the remembered. Her report was the first official police document to acknowledge that the Great Disappearance had been caused by something that could be studied, tracked, and potentially prevented. It was buried immediately by departments that weren't ready to accept that reality could be edited by voices in walls. But it reached the right people. Scientists who specialized in anomalous phenomena, military analysts who tracked unconventional threats, government officials who dealt with problems that officially didn't exist. A new infrastructure developed around the Watchers. Not the informal network of isolated individuals that I'd tried to build, but an actual organization with funding and resources and legal authority to investigate cases involving impossible architecture and voices from nowhere. They called it the Department of Structural Anomalies, and Sarah became its first field director. Within 6 months, they had documented 1,247 attempted callings worldwide. Families who heard the voices but chose to resist. Houses that tried to transform themselves but were stopped by intervention teams. Children who drew pictures of doorways but were reached by counselors before they could open them. The children in the walls had learned from the Great Disappearance, too. They'd realized that taking everyone at once had been a mistake, that it had made their existence visible to people who might be able to fight them. They returned to their original strategy of individual families, small-scale disappearances that could be explained away or forgotten. But now there were people watching for them. People who understood the patterns, who knew the warning signs, who could intervene before the calling reached its target. Sarah's team saved thousands of families in that first year. They developed protocols for detecting structural anomalies, medications that could block the psychological effects of the calling, architectural modifications that could prevent houses from transforming themselves. It wasn't a complete victory. For every family they saved, another slipped through their surveillance. Another set of names was added to the ever-growing list of the disappeared. But it was progress. The first time in over a century that anyone had successfully fought back against the calling. The children in the walls adapted again. Instead of calling to entire families, they began targeting individual children. The lonely ones, the isolated ones, the ones whose families were already broken by divorce or death or distance. Children who were more likely to hear the voices, more likely to believe the promises of eternal togetherness, more likely to walk through doorways that their parents couldn't see. Sarah's team adapted too. They developed early warning systems based on children's behavioral patterns, school counseling programs that could identify at-risk students, foster care protocols that prioritized family stability over bureaucratic efficiency. It became an arms race between those who wanted to preserve families in the real world and those who wanted to collect them for the spaces between. Each side learned from the other's tactics, developed new strategies, found new ways to reach the children who were caught between competing definitions of what family meant. By the third anniversary of the Great Disappearance, Sarah had built an organization of 10,000 watchers worldwide. They operated from offices that looked like ordinary government buildings, but were designed according to architectural principles that prevented the formation of doorways to elsewhere. They carried equipment that could detect the early stages of structural transformation, medications that could protect against the psychological effects of the calling, communication devices that couldn't be intercepted by voices from the spaces between. They saved millions of families. They documented thousands of attempted callings. They built the first comprehensive database of structural anomalies, mapping the invisible geography that connected houses where families had disappeared to houses where families still lived. But they also understood that they were fighting a holding action, not a winning battle. The children in the walls were patient in ways that human organizations could never be. They could wait decades between attempts, could adapt to any defensive strategy given enough time, could always find new ways to reach children who needed to believe that families could be forever. Sarah's final report, filed on the 5th anniversary of the Great Disappearance, acknowledged this reality with the same brutal honesty I had tried to bring to my own documentation. "The calling cannot be stopped," she wrote. "It can be delayed, redirected, minimized, but not eliminated. It represents something fundamental about human nature, the desire for connection, for belonging, for love that transcends the limitations of time and space. What we can do is ensure that families understand the choice they're making. We can make sure they know that the real world, for all its flaws and limitations and heartbreaks, offers something that the spaces between cannot: growth, change, the possibility that love can evolve and deepen and become something more than it was. The children in the walls offer eternal togetherness. We offer the chance to build togetherness that means something because it was chosen, maintained, and renewed every day by people who could have walked away but decided to stay. In the end, that might be enough. Not to win, but to ensure that the choice remains available to those who want to make it. Sarah retired from active duty that same year, but she didn't stop watching. None of us ever stop watching. Once you've seen the doorways, once you've heard the voices, once you've carried the weight of names and faces and families who trusted their children to lead them somewhere safe, you can never quite stop listening for the scratching in the walls. I know this because I can see her sometimes, when the light is right and the shadows fall at the correct angles. She's older now, gray-haired and tired, but still writing names in notebooks, still remembering families who chose the spaces between over the real world. I arrived at the Hollow Creek overlook just past 10 o'clock, the cruiser's idling engine rattling in the stillness like a death rattle. The radio was silent. No dispatch traffic, no neighboring units answering routine check-ins, and for a moment, I let myself believe the night might pass without incident. My flashlight lay on the passenger seat, its battery half dead, the beam irregular, but it was better than nothing. I wrapped my coat tighter against the October chill, slipped out, and closed the door softly, careful not to shatter the illusion that this was just another quiet shift. The overlook was perched on the edge of Morgan's Ridge, an old estate left to decay sometime in the late 1970s. Folks around town whispered that the original family line had died out in some scandal no one could remember clearly. An heir lost in a car wreck. A daughter who vanished into the woods. The mansion itself sat back from the ditch cut by the county road, hidden behind a forest of oaks and pines so thick you almost couldn't see it until you were within 20 yards. Tonight, half its windows were boarded, the rest shattered or clouded with grime. A single porch light flickered on a rusted sconce, its glow weak as if struggling not to go out. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam across the cracked asphalt of the long driveway, counting the potholes that had formed in circles. Somewhere mice and snakes made their nests. I radioed dispatch. Unit 12 checking in at Hollow Creek. No movement yet, over. My voice sounded flat in my earpiece, lacking the confidence I used to have. 15 years on the force, and only a few nights ago, I dreamed of hands reaching through the walls of the precinct interview room. I told myself it was nothing, just stress, but I still carried a tremor in my chest that wouldn't fade. I climbed from the cruiser and walked toward the wrought iron gate, its paint flaking away in jagged scales. My boots crunched on gravel. The beam flickered again. Flicker, flicker, leaving me in darkness for a heartbeat before sputtering back to life. I hated that. It made me feel exposed. I tapped the flashlight against my palm, heard the hollow ring, and cursed under my breath. I'd need to rely on my service weapon if things went south, but the last time I'd fired a round, it still haunted me. A suspect had come at me swinging a crowbar, and the kid had died with blood flooding the hallway tiles. I still saw his eyes. Beyond the gate, I moved down the overgrown walkway toward the front door. The house rose like a wounded thing, its stone pillars pitted by time and vines. The wood paneling around the door was splintered, as though someone had tried to break in and given up. I pressed my ear to the surface and listened. Nothing. No creak of floorboards, no rustle of animal in the walls. But then, a faint thump, like footsteps upstairs. I tightened my grip on the mag light and keyed my mic. Dispatch, I think I've got movement on the second floor. Advise backup, possible trespasser. My words crackled through the static, and I heard the faint buzz of dispatch acknowledging. Good. I needed someone to blame if this went wrong. I stepped inside. The door gave way with a groan that echoed into the foyer. The air was heavy with rot and a sweetness I couldn't place, like decaying flowers mixed with old sugar. My flashlight beam cut through the dust motes, revealing a grand staircase winding upward, its banister a twisted relic of mahogany that had turned gray. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in tatters. On the floor lay broken picture frames and fragments of porcelain vases. I recognized the outline of a family portrait. A father in uniform, his arm around a young woman in a white dress, her eyes glassy with forced happiness. I swallowed and advanced. Every nerve in my body screamed to turn back. The beam swept left to the parlor, where the remains of a piano sat collapsed, keys yellowed and cracked. I remembered childhood stories about the Whitmore mansion south of here. How late at night people heard piano music when no one was there. The thought made my skin crawl, but tonight it was just this place, this Hollow Creek estate, and maybe a stray cat. I pressed on, one foot in front of the other. Halfway down the hallway, I noticed footprints in the dust, bare, small, like a child's. They trailed toward a door marked Library. My pulse caught. How often do kids wander abandoned mansions? Not often. I eased the door open. Its hinges shrieked like a tortured soul. Inside, shelves once grand sagged under the weight of rot. A single book lay face down on a table, a pattern of shadows by some author I didn't recognize. I knelt and picked it up, fingertips brushing the cover cloth. It was warm to the touch. My heart hammered. Nothing in this house should have warmth. Then, a whisper through my earpiece, low and urgent. "Stay away," it said. Just those two words, followed by static. I jerked the radio away from my ear. Channel 4 was silent. My own voice came back to me on the speaker. "Stay away." I looked at the book, then around the room. No one there, just dust and books rotting in their spines. I swallowed and closed the door gently. The footprints continued past me down the corridor. I decided to follow them, flashlight sweeping, gun drawn. I felt ridiculous. An officer stalking a ghost. But my gut told me this wasn't ordinary. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. From behind it came the unmistakable sound of someone crying, soft, broken sobs, echoing in the shuttered darkness. The crack in the door was narrow. I peered through. A girl sat huddled in the center of the room. She wore an old-fashioned nightgown, and her hair hung in wet strands over her face. In her lap was a doll, one of those porcelain-head dolls with painted cheeks and eyes that opened on springs. But the doll's eyes were closed, and its porcelain face was cracked, as though struck too hard and patched with something dark. "Ma'am?" I said, voice low. The girl hunched tighter, rocking side to side. "Hey, it's okay, you're safe." My words died on my tongue. The light from my beam played across the wall behind her, and I saw words scratched into the plaster. "Help me." The letters jagged, uneven, half erased by time. Beneath that, something newer. "You're next." The words oozed dread I could taste. The girl looked up. Her eyes were empty pits, blacker than the dark around her. She tilted her head and whispered, voice childish but distant, "They come for you." Her mouth didn't move in sync with the voice that echoed in my radio. "Don't turn around." I spun, maglite swinging, into empty air and felt a cold hand brush my shoulder. I yanked free, momentarily blinded by the beam. Then I heard it, soft giggling, like the ringing of broken bells. The room door slammed shut behind me. I froze, heart in my throat, and slowly turned back to the girl, only she was gone. The doll lay shattered on the floor, porcelain shards scattered like bones. My radio crackled. "Dispatch, Unit 12, you still with us?" I squeezed the mic. I'm still here. Something's wrong. I need..." Static swallowed my words. Then a scream, my own voice, screaming, echoed through the receiver. I stumbled back, dropping the maglite. Darkness swallowed me whole as I fumbled for my weapon. Above me, the house groaned. The lights in the corridor flickered on for a heartbeat, illuminating the footprints now running back toward the foyer, as though someone, or something, was fleeing. The beam from my fallen flashlight sputtered and died. I raised my pistol into pitch black. My breath caught, and I felt that same sweetness in the air, thick as syrup. Then, unmistakably, a child's laughter, gleeful, mocking, drifted down from the ceiling, closer now, circling me in the silence. And in that instant I realized I should have left the moment I heard the whisper on the radio. But it was too late to turn back. Something was here with me, and it wasn't going to let me go without a fight. I stumbled backward, heart hammering so hard I could almost feel it in my throat. The laughter swelled around me, a dozen childish voices overlapping, coming from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere at once. My finger tightened on the trigger, knuckles white. I clicked the safety off and swept the beam of my spare light across the floor, only to realize it lay broken where I'd dropped it. Darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating. I forced myself to move, one careful step at a time, following the faint scuff of those footprints, the ones that led in and out of the library room. I had to find an exit, had to get out before whatever this was closed in on me. My boot caught on a splintered board. I nearly fell. When I righted myself, I saw, scrawled in fresh chalk on the floorboards, a single word: wait. The letters were large, uneven, drawn by a hand that trembled with panic. I swallowed. Wait for what? My radio crackled again, a garbled mess of static and half-words. I keyed the mic. "Dispatch, Unit 12, do you copy?" My own voice sounded hollow. Static surged, then subsided long enough for a whisper to slip through. "Don't come back." The words were the same as before, but now there were more. Faint syllables tangled in the hiss, like an echo chamber of countless voices. "Run," it said, "or stay forever." I raised my pistol and yelled into the darkness, "Show yourself!" My voice cracked on the last word. Silence answered. Then footsteps, light, deliberate, skirting around me in a slow circle. I spun, muzzle swinging, but found nothing. My flashlight's dying battery flickered one last time, revealing at the edge of its glow a little girl's doll, seated on the stairs. Her ceramic face was intact now, but her eyes were open, glassy, reflecting a light I didn't have. Her painted lips curved in a smile that felt like a trap. I swallowed hard and forced myself up the staircase. Each step creaked under my weight. The doll remained on the bottom tread, unmoving, as though guarding the path. Halfway up, the beam caught another message on the wall. This time written in what looked like charcoal. "You forgot us." My breath caught. Who was us? I'd seen no faces, heard only whispers. Yet here, in this house, everything was pointing at me, accusing, reminding. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched away, lined with doors. One on the left was cracked. A sliver of dim orange light glowed beneath. I inched closer, pistol trembling, and pushed the door open. Inside, an old nursery, peeling pastel wallpaper patterned with lambs, a toppled rocking horse lying on its side. There, in the center of the room, a tiny bed with white sheets, pristine, unwrinkled, and the faint smell of perfume hung in the air. I stepped forward, beam sweeping the mattress. On it lay a handkerchief, embroidered with initials, M.W. I recognized them immediately. Morgan Whitmore. The original owner's daughter vanished decades ago. My mind spun. If she'd vanished here, was this where she died? Or was she still here, in some twisted half-life? I lifted the handkerchief, fingertips brushing the silky fabric. It was stained, not with blood, but something darker, an oily residue that clung to my glove. I pressed the cloth to my nose. The scent was sweet, floral, and sickening. I heard a whisper behind me. "Wear it." I spun, but no one stood there. My chest tightened. I could feel sweat beating at my temples despite the cold. I folded the handkerchief into my coat pocket. I needed to keep moving, needed to find the front door and get whatever evidence I could back to the station. A sudden crash roared through the house like furniture overturned. The ceiling above groaned, and a shower of dust rained down. I ducked instinctively. When I looked up, the ceiling panel nearest the nursery door sagged, splitting open to reveal darkness yawning above. From that void, a low, keening wail echoed, half human, half mechanical, an inhuman lament that rattled my teeth. I imagined splinters of plaster falling to my shoulders. Then the wail cut off mid-scream and silence returned, so complete it felt oppressive. I stumbled back into the hallway, leaving the nursery door ajar. The beam of my flashlight bobbed wildly as I ran, tracking the walls for signs of another exit. But the corridor was different now. Doors that had been there before were gone, replaced by blank stretches of cracked plaster. The portrait of the uniformed man I'd seen downstairs reappeared here, though I'd never passed it on this floor. The eyes in the painting followed me, narrowing as I passed. At the end of the hall I found a staircase leading down, but not the staircase I'd ascended. This one curved steeply, the banister carved with twisted faces. The steps were slick with something dark that glistened under my flashlight. My skin prickled. I took a tentative step down. The walls closed in, the ceiling low. A thick mist hovered at the bottom, obscuring anything beyond the first few treads. I crouched, lowered my ear. Beneath the hush, I heard faint murmurs, like therapy sessions or confessions, broken phrases of intercom code and interrogation transcripts. I froze, hand on the railing. The metal was ice cold. A whispered voice drifted up the stairs. "Here, with us." It sounded like my own voice, echoing from some distant chamber. I blinked and almost didn't recognize the word carved into the banister. Trust. I shook my head, chest heaving. Trust what, the house? Myself? I couldn't tell anymore. Summoning what remained of my courage, I descended into the fog. Each step seemed to stretch on forever, until finally I reached the bottom. The mist parted to reveal a long, narrow hallway lined with offices. Old police reaction rooms, I realized, from some decades-old precinct, not this mansion. Each door bore a plaque. Room 1, Room 2, all the way to Room 8. My breath caught at Room 7, the mirror room from that Riverside case I'd read about years ago. The door stood ajar, just like the others, but behind its frame, instead of a mirror, was black emptiness. I approached Room 7. My flashlight trembled so badly, the beam flitted across the walls like a trapped insect. I pressed my hand against the door jamb and peered in. The floor was bare concrete. The walls were smooth and unadorned. But on the far wall, near the ceiling, someone had scrawled in fresh blood. Though where the blood had come from, I had no idea. It read, "They've returned." My radio died in that moment. No static, no whisper, just an all-consuming silence. I felt it before I heard it. A low hum, steadily rising in pitch until it filled my skull. My fingers bled where I'd pressed them against the door. I stumbled back, falling to my knees. The hum crescendoed, and the emptiness in the doorway seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. A sudden gust of wind tore through the hallway, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging me into total darkness. I heard the doors on either side slam shut at the same time, trapping me in that narrow space. Panic clawed at my lungs. I fumbled for my pistol, but it had vanished. I must have dropped it on the stairs. All I had left was the handkerchief in my pocket and my own 2 hands. Then the lights flickered on. Weak bulbs mounted in the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow glow. As my eyes adjusted, I saw them, shadows pooling in each doorway, shapes so indistinct I couldn't say if they were human. They shifted, stretching long arms, or was that my imagination? Then one figure stepped forward into the hallway. It wore a uniform like mine, though tattered, its badge impossible to read. Its face was half hidden in shadow, but I knew those eyes, my own reflection, twisted by fear and regret. It smiled, lips peeling back to show teeth that looked like broken glass, and it raised a hand, palm toward me, in a slow, beckoning motion. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My legs felt like lead, refusing to move. The figure took another step, and behind it, in each doorframe, more silhouettes pressed forward. Echoes of me, and of those who had come before. The hum became a roar of static and voices, telling me to join them, to stay forever in this place beyond reason. And as the door to room 7 creaked closed behind me, sealing off any chance of retreat, I realized with absolute certainty that the Hollow Creek overlook was no accident on the map, and I was never meant to leave. The corridor darkened, the glow faded, and all I could hear was that fractured laugh receding into the distance, calling me to follow. I forced my legs into motion despite the paralysis clawing at my mind. Each step toward the blackened doorway of room 7 felt like wading through molasses. My uniform heavy on my shoulders, every breath a battle against the pull of that humming void. The silhouettes waiting in the doorways beyond were impossibly tall, limbs elongated like the shadows you see when the sun's too low and your mind's too tired. Their forms flickered at the edges, as though reality itself was trying and failing to hold them together. I reached the threshold and paused. My chest trembled, pistol still missing, maglite dead in my pocket. I clutched the handkerchief, the initials MW pressed into the silk like a mocking invitation. The residue on my glove burned against my skin, a reminder of the nursery, of the girl's whisper. I thought of her crying, her voice echoing, "They come for you." I swallowed hard, then stepped inside. The air in room 7 was colder than any winter night I'd ever faced. Cold enough to see my breath, cold enough to make the hairs on my arms stand straight up. My feet sank into something damp. Water? No, it was thicker, like slurry. Mud, mixed with something dark that clung to my boots and tried to pull me in. I looked down and saw footprints leading into the center of the room, then continuing through a gash in the concrete floor. The gash was new, jagged, as though the house itself had torn open under strain. From that fissure rose a light, weak, pulsating the color of bruised flesh. I leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Inside, I saw a spiral of stairs leading downward, curving into an abyss that tasted of regret and sorrow. Behind me, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. I spun, heart slamming, but no one stood there, just empty door. The hum swelled, and I covered my ears, but the sound came from inside my skull, each pulse of noise cracking across my eardrums like breaking glass. I staggered, pressed my back to the wall, and slid down until I sat in the slurry, the fibers of my uniform damp and cold against my skin. I pressed my palms to my temples, tried to make it stop, anything to shut it out. Then, unmistakably, over the roar, a voice. Soft, distant, and achingly familiar. My own voice, reading from an old police report. The subject exhibits signs of auditory hallucinations, reports voices commanding movement, it said. Then another voice, the same but warped. "You forgot us." And another, "Come home." The echo grew until it was a chorus, filling every corner of my mind. I trembled, head in my hands. Was this what I'd been chasing? A memory? A coded warning? I thought of the kid I'd shot. Cold metal of the taser, the weight of his lifeless body in my arms. I thought of the suspects who'd clawed for mercy, the nights I couldn't sleep. This house was a mirror, reflecting every guilt and regret I'd tucked away. But I needed more than reflection. I needed escape. Gathering myself, I crawled to the edge of the fissure. The steps downward beckoned, the bruised fleshlight pulsing in welcome. My handkerchief was cold in my pocket. I pressed my thumb to the initials. Thought of Morgan Whitmore, her doll, her handkerchief, and wondered if she had been here, in these subterranean levels, waiting all this time. My training screamed at me to turn back. My gut said, "Keep going." I climbed to my feet and stepped onto the first stair. It moaned under my weight. With each descent, the hum deepened, vibrating through my boots up my legs, twisting my spine. The walls closed in, slick with condensation, carved with names, officers who'd come before, etched into stone. R. Hayes, D. Torres, M. Reed. My breath caught. These were real people I knew. Some had left the force. Others were grieving survivors of this same corridor. I pressed on, reading each name as though the very act kept me tethered to reality. At the bottom, I stumbled into a vast chamber ringed with observation windows. Beyond each pane, dark silhouettes pressed close, features indistinct, faces melting into shadow. In the center stood an elevator, old, stainless steel tarnished to black. Its doors were ajar, revealing a small interior lined with mirrors. Mirrors that reflected not me, but the peeling wallpaper of the nursery, the broken doll, the child's empty eyes. I approached, the voices ebbing into a hush as I neared. The elevator floor was littered with fragments of what looked like family photos. Smiling faces burned and sliced, edges curled and blackened. I picked up one piece, my own face, cropped at the jawline, eyes scratched away. I dropped it, and the hum returned, low and insistent. Without thinking, I stepped into the elevator. The doors groaned closed behind me. Inside, the mirrors rippled as though warm breath pressed against them, distorting my reflection into dozens of me. Tired, fearful, broken. My heart pounded. The control panel bore only one button, a red circle with no label. I pressed it. The elevator lurched downward. No indicator lights, no hum of machinery, just the rain of footsteps that circled the compartment as the doors slid apart. Outside was a corridor bathed in darkness so absolute I almost couldn't see the threshold. In that darkness, the whisper came again. "Welcome home." I raised my handkerchief, held it to my face. The residue flaked off in gray flakes. I realized I'd never felt more alive. The corridor stretched out, lined with cell doors. Beyond them, muffled voices, cries, confessions, laughter, pleading. I could see shapes moving behind the bars. They looked like me, like the silhouettes upstairs, but always just beyond reach. I turned to step forward, and the door behind me slammed shut. The elevator vanished. My arm jerked back. My hand went reflexively to my belt, where my service taser should have been. It wasn't. I patted my pockets, empty. I was unarmed, alone, inside some forgotten artery of this place that shouldn't exist. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate footsteps, approaching from the end of the corridor. Not multiple footsteps, but one pair, heavy, measured. I trained my empty hand where I'd last felt the weight of my pistol. Each footfall echoed. The door at the corridor's end scraped open, and a figure stepped out. It wore a sheriff's uniform, blue shirt, badge brilliant silver in the gloom. Its boots were polished to a mirror sheen, but its face was nothing but a void. No skin, no features, just darkness where bone should be. It tilted its head, and I felt a pull in my gut like being sucked toward a void. I took a shaky breath. "Who are you?" I managed to croak. No answer. The figure lifted a hand, fingers curved in invitation. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted. The corridor behind me glowed dimly, and I saw dozens of faces pressed against the bars. My reflection, their eyes glassy with accusation. The figure stepped closer. Its movements were fluid, almost graceful, but utterly alien. I tried again. "I'm a cop." My words died. The figure raised its hand again, and in that motion, I heard the echo of every voice I'd ever silenced, every cry I'd ignored, every regret I'd buried. In that moment, I realized there was no escape. The Hollow Creek overlook had claimed me, stitched my sorrow into its walls. And as the void of that face opened into a blackness deeper than night, I understood the truth. I had become as lost as the girl in the library, as broken as the officers whose names were etched into the stairwell.